Mafia boss defended elderly woman insulted by driver. What he did surprised everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a chilly afternoon in New York City, the streets bustling with people running errands and cars honking as they sped through the crowded avenues. Among the chaos, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson was struggling to get into a cab. With shaking hands, she tried to adjust the weight of her cane and maneuver herself into the back seat. But her efforts were met with impatience from the young driver. "Come on, lady, hurry up," the driver barked, his voice laced with annoyance. Mrs. Thompson winced, her old bones aching from the effort, and despite her best efforts, she stumbled, nearly losing her balance. The driver scoffed, muttering under his breath as he rolled his eyes, clearly irritated by her slow pace. "People like you shouldn't be on the road," he sneered, his words cutting through the cold air. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed, not from the cold, but from the humiliation. She was just trying to get home, but this driver's disrespect had wounded her deeply. She had lived in this city for decades, seen its best and worst moments, and yet nothing had prepared her for this. As the driver began to rev his engine, ready to drive off, Mrs. Thompson felt a lump rise in her throat. But just as the car started to pull away, a sleek black limousine pulled up beside her, its tinted windows reflecting the cold afternoon light. The door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. It was Victor D'Angelo, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York, known for his control over the city's underground operations. He was a man who rarely showed emotion, but the scene unfolding in front of him sparked something inside him that he had long kept buried. Without a word, Victor walked up to the young driver's car and knocked sharply on the window. The driver, startled, rolled down the window just enough to peek out. "You have a problem with her?" Victor's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it that made the driver's stomach churn. The driver, realizing who was speaking to him, paled. "No, sir, I didn't mean any disrespect," he stammered, trying to backtrack. But it was too late. "You disrespected her. That's enough," Victor said, his tone final. With a swift motion, Victor reached for the driver's door and yanked it open, pulling the young man out of the car with ease. The driver, now shaking, tried to apologize again, but Victor was already pulling out a wad of cash and tossing it at him. "For the damage to your pride," he muttered, his eyes cold. "Now, get out of here before I change my mind." The driver scrambled to get away, his face red with embarrassment and fear. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. Victor turned to her, his demeanor shifting instantly to one of kindness. "Are you all right, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. She looked up at him, not quite understanding what was going on. Her mind was still reeling from the sudden turn of events. I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice trembling, still in shock from the encounter. Victor gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll make sure you get home safely," he said, guiding her gently into the back of the limo. As the door closed behind her, Victor got back into the driver's seat and motioned for his men to follow. Mrs. Thompson, still processing what had just happened, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. She had been humiliated just moments before, but now she was being treated with dignity by someone who didn't have to care. As the limousine sped through the streets of New York, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but wonder what had made Victor D'Angelo step in when no one else did. Little did she know, this unexpected act of kindness would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. "I apologize for the incident earlier. As you can see, things got a little out of hand, but it's good to know that you're okay." Victor's voice was calm, yet there was an edge of concern in it. As he guided Mrs. Thompson into the back of the limousine, she could still feel the trembling in her hands, the mix of confusion and gratitude swirling inside her. As the door closed behind her, she looked out through the tinted windows of the car. The city seemed so different from this vantage point. The chaos of the streets now felt distant, almost surreal. Her mind was racing. She had lived in New York for most of her life, but she had never expected to find herself in this situation. She had been humiliated in front of strangers, mocked by a driver she would never see again, only to be saved by someone like Victor D'Angelo, a man whose name carried weight, whose presence commanded respect. She had heard the whispers, the rumors about Victor, but she had never imagined crossing paths with him, let alone having him come to her defense. His reputation alone should have made him someone to fear, not to seek help from. But somehow, his actions had been the opposite. He had treated her with kindness, with dignity. And for that, she was grateful. She stole a quick glance at Victor as he sat in the front seat of the limousine, his expression unreadable, his focus fixed on the road ahead. His large frame barely fit in the seat, his black suit impeccably tailored to his powerful build. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the confidence of someone who was used to controlling everything around him. "Thank you," Mrs. Thompson said softly, breaking the silence. Victor glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "No need to thank me," he replied, his voice smooth and controlled. "I saw what happened, and I couldn't just stand by." Mrs. Thompson nodded, unsure of what else to say. She had always been a woman of few words, but something about Victor's calm demeanor made her want to speak. "I don't know why you did it," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to. You could have just walked away." Victor's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't do things because I have to, Mrs. Thompson. I do them because it's the right thing to do." Mrs. Thompson was taken aback by his answer. She had expected a more cold, calculating response from someone like Victor. Instead, he had spoken with a sincerity that she couldn't quite place. It was unexpected, unsettling, but also strangely comforting. The limo drove on, the city slowly fading into the background as they made their way to her small apartment on the edge of the city. Mrs. Thompson had lived there for years, in a modest building that was starting to show signs of age. It was nothing fancy, but it had been her home for so long that she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. As the car came to a stop in front of the building, Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure if she should just thank him and leave, or if she should say more. She wasn't used to being in situations where she had to express gratitude for something that felt so out of place. Victor turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, holding the door open for her. "I'll walk you up," he said, his tone leaving little room for protest. Mrs. Thompson hesitated again, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded and stepped out of the car, her legs still a little shaky from the earlier ordeal. As they made their way up the stairs to her apartment, she couldn't help but notice the way Victor moved, the grace with which he walked, even in such an ordinary setting. There was an air of authority around him, but it wasn't oppressive. It was more like a quiet power, the kind that made people listen when he spoke. When they reached her door, Mrs. Thompson fumbled for her keys. Her hands were still trembling, but she finally found them and unlocked the door. Victor stood by the doorway, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as ever. "You should rest," he said. "I'll make sure nothing like this happens again." Mrs. Thompson turned to look at him, still trying to process everything that had happened. I don't know how to thank you." Victor gave a small, reassuring smile. "No need," he said again. "Just take care of yourself." As she stepped inside her apartment, Mrs. Thompson turned back to him. She wanted to ask more, to know more about the man who had come to her rescue, but she wasn't sure how to approach it. She didn't want to seem too curious or intrusive. Victor, however, seemed to read her mind. "Don't worry," he said, as if sensing her hesitation. "You're safe now." With that, he turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building. Mrs. Thompson watched him disappear around the corner, still in disbelief over the turn of events. She had gone from being a woman humiliated in public to being escorted by a Mafia boss, someone who had given her protection and, in some strange way, a sense of peace. She closed the door behind her, leaned against it for a moment, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What had just happened? And why had Victor D'Angelo cared? Little did she know, this unexpected act of kindness was only the beginning of something that would change her life forever. "I apologize for keeping you waiting, Mrs. Thompson." Victor's voice was steady, but Mrs. Thompson could hear the faint hint of concern. She had spent the evening reflecting on the events that had unfolded earlier that day, trying to make sense of the unexpected turn of events. She was still unsure of how she felt about Victor D'Angelo, the man who had come to her rescue, but something about him kept lingering in her thoughts. As the night wore on, she found herself wondering about the man who had stepped into her life so suddenly. The following morning, she awoke to the soft sound of birds outside her window. The sun streamed through the cracks in the curtains, casting a warm glow on her small living room. She hadn't expected to sleep so peacefully, especially after everything that had happened. But there she was, waking up to a new day in her modest apartment, feeling strangely at ease. She hadn't been able to sleep much the night before, constantly replaying the moment when Victor had stepped in to defend her. It had all happened so fast, too fast for her to fully comprehend. Why had he done it? Was it simply out of a sense of duty, or was there something more to his actions? Mrs. Thompson sat at her kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee, staring out the window as the street below began to come alive. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitant, she walked over and peered through the peephole. To her surprise, it was Victor standing outside, looking as composed as ever. His sharp suit and commanding presence felt out of place in the small, worn hallway of her apartment building. For a moment, she simply stood there, unsure of what to do. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon. She opened the door slowly, her heart racing in her chest. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Victor said with a small, polite smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." No, Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice shaky. "I just wasn't expecting you." Victor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the small space. He didn't seem to notice the worn-out furniture or the dusty shelves. His attention was focused on her, his gaze unwavering. "I came to check in on you," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an underlying seriousness. "I need to make sure you're all right after yesterday." Mrs. Thompson wasn't sure what to say. She had never been in a situation like this before, where someone of Victor's stature had taken such an interest in her well-being. She had spent years keeping to herself, never asking for help, never expecting anyone to notice her struggles. Yet here he was, standing in her modest living room, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'm fine," she said finally, though her voice trembled. "Really I am. Thank you again for yesterday." "It wasn't a problem," Victor replied, his tone still calm and collected. "But I need you to understand that you're not alone in this, Mrs. Thompson. Not anymore." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't sure what he meant by that. Did he expect her to get involved in his world? The world of power and danger that he moved in? She wasn't sure she was ready for that. "I don't understand," she said quietly, the doubt in her voice clear. "Why would you do this for me? I'm just an old woman, trying to live quietly." Victor's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained stoic. "It's not about who you are, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "It's about doing what's right. You were wronged, and I won't let that slide. People like that driver need to understand that there are consequences to their actions." Mrs. Thompson nodded, still unsure of what to make of it all. She had never been one to ask for help, much less from someone like Victor. But his words were reassuring in some way. "But there's more to it than that, isn't there?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Victor looked at her, his gaze piercing. "There is," he admitted, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "But that's not for today. For now, I want you to know that I'm here to make sure you're safe. And I want you to trust that I will protect you if necessary." His words were not a promise, but a statement of fact. It was clear to her that he meant every word, and that he wasn't someone to make idle threats. Mrs. Thompson stood still for a moment, processing his words. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had lived her whole life avoiding attention, staying out of trouble, and now here she was, in the middle of something far bigger than she had ever imagined. "I don't know what to say," she said quietly, her eyes searching his for some kind of reassurance. "You don't need to say anything," Victor replied with a faint smile. "Just remember that you're not alone." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Thompson watched him go, still in disbelief over what had just transpired. What kind of man was Victor D'Angelo? And how had she become involved in his world? She couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and curiosity about the future. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would lead her down a path she could never have predicted. "I hope you're doing well, Mrs. Thompson," Victor said, his voice calm as he walked into her apartment the following day. The quiet apartment felt different now, somehow more alive with the presence of someone like Victor D'Angelo. Mrs. Thompson had been trying to keep her composure since the moment he had stepped back into her life. His words, his presence, everything felt surreal. She had never expected this kind of attention, especially from a man like him. The Mafia boss, the man who controlled more of the city than most could even comprehend, had stepped into her world and was offering her something she wasn't sure she wanted: protection, care, and perhaps more than she could handle. "You've been good to me, but this is all too much," Mrs. Thompson responded, her voice shaky, betraying her uncertainty. She stood by the window, staring out at the busy street below, her mind still struggling to comprehend what had happened in the past 48 hours. Victor paused just inside the door, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, watching her carefully. "You don't have to worry. I'm not here to cause any more trouble," he said, his tone reassuring, though there was a quiet intensity in his words. He had noticed her hesitation, the way her hands trembled whenever he spoke. "I know this is a lot to process, but I made a promise to you, and I don't break promises." Mrs. Thompson turned to face him, her brow furrowed. She wasn't sure if she should trust him, if she should let him into her life in the way he seemed to want. After all, he was a man whose name was whispered with both fear and respect, a man whose world was filled with things she couldn't even begin to understand. "I don't want to be a part of your world, Victor," she said, her voice firm, though there was a slight tremor in it. "I'm just an old woman trying to live out her days in peace." Victor's face softened slightly, though his expression remained controlled. He stepped closer, not threatening, but with a quiet confidence that made Mrs. Thompson uneasy. "And you will," he said, his voice gentle. "But I can't allow someone to disrespect you like that again. Not on my watch." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Thompson found herself swallowing hard. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected someone like Victor to care. What could he possibly want from her? Why was he doing this? "I don't know what you want from me," she whispered, her hands still shaking as she gripped the edge of the windowsill. "I've lived alone for so long. I've made my peace with it. But now you're here, and I don't know what that means." Victor was silent for a moment, his gaze never leaving her. He seemed to be measuring her words, weighing the situation in his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Mrs. Thompson, but I am asking you to trust me. You're safe now, and I'm not going anywhere until I'm sure of it." There was something in his eyes, something she hadn't expected: sincerity. For all his power, all his reputation, there was a gentleness in the way he spoke to her. Mrs. Thompson had seen many men in her time, men who wielded power, but none of them had ever treated her with such respect. She didn't know what to make of it, but a part of her wanted to believe him. She had spent so many years trying to stay unnoticed, trying to avoid drawing attention, but Victor had forced her into the spotlight, whether she liked it or not. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know what to say to a man like him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the world she had known for so long was shifting under her feet. "I don't know what to say," she replied finally, her voice small, uncertain. "I've lived my whole life quietly, and now, I don't know how to deal with this." Victor took another step forward, stopping just in front of her. He looked down at her with a steady gaze, his features softening just slightly. "You don't have to say anything, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just know that you're not alone anymore. That's all I'm asking." The words hung between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Thompson felt the weight of them, the promise of protection and safety. It was a foreign concept to her, one that she had never allowed herself to entertain. But now, in this moment, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have someone in her corner, someone who could protect her when the world seemed so indifferent. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no choice but to accept what was happening. Victor was already a part of her life, whether she liked it or not. And as she looked at him, she realized that, for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of security, however fleeting it might be. "All right," she said, her voice steadying. "I'll trust you, but don't make me regret it." Victor smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "You won't," he promised. And with that, he turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving Mrs. Thompson to face the uncertain future ahead. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time, Mrs. Thompson allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Little did she know, This was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. "I didn't expect to see you here today, Mrs. Thompson." Victor's voice broke the silence as he stepped into her apartment once again. Mrs. Thompson was seated by the window, her hands clasped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She had spent the past few hours reflecting on the strange events that had unfolded in her life. The man who had come to her rescue, a man with more power than she had ever imagined, had been a constant presence in her thoughts. She wasn't sure if she should be grateful or afraid. "I didn't expect to see you either," she said quietly, her voice uncertain. Her mind was still racing, and she wasn't sure how to navigate this new reality. She had always lived alone, keeping to herself and avoiding trouble, but now, it seemed that trouble had come to her doorstep, in the form of Victor D'Angelo. He was standing there, in her small apartment, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She had been avoiding this moment, but she knew she couldn't keep pushing it away forever. He had been kind to her, perhaps even too kind, and she had no idea what he expected in return. "I just came to check on you," Victor said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I know it's a lot to process, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this." Mrs. Thompson's hands tightened around her cup as she stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question that had been on her mind since the moment he had intervened. "I'm just a woman trying to live a quiet life. I don't belong in your world." Victor's expression softened, though there was still a hard edge to his gaze. "You don't have to belong to my world to be treated with respect," he replied, his voice steady. "What happened yesterday was wrong. You don't deserve to be treated that way, and I won't allow anyone to disrespect you again." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, her mind still spinning. She didn't know what to make of his words, of the way he seemed to care about her, despite the vast difference in their worlds. "I don't want to be a burden," she said softly. "I don't need your protection. I can handle things on my own." Victor looked at her, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You don't have to handle everything on your own, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "You don't have to fight every battle by yourself. Not anymore." Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat as his words sank in. She had spent so long fighting to survive, to keep her head down and stay out of trouble. But now, for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face everything alone. "I don't know how to accept this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not used to people caring about me." Victor's eyes softened. "I understand," he said, "but you don't have to understand it all right now. Just know that you have people who care about you. People who will stand by you, no matter what." Mrs. Thompson was silent for a moment, the weight of his words heavy in the air. She didn't know if she could ever fully trust him, but she couldn't deny the way his presence made her feel safe. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She didn't feel like she had to hide in the shadows anymore. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Victor smiled, though it was a small, almost wistful smile. "Now, we take things one step at a time," he said. "I'll make sure you're protected, but I won't push you into anything you're not ready for." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't filled with dread. She wasn't sure what kind of man Victor was, but there was something about him, something that made her believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't filled with loneliness and fear. As he turned to leave, Victor stopped at the door, his hand resting on the knob. "And Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice low, "you're more than welcome to reach out to me if you ever need anything. I mean it." She glanced up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words didn't feel like enough. Victor nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Thompson," he said before stepping out of the apartment, leaving her alone once again. Mrs. Thompson stood there for a moment, the silence in the room almost deafening. She had spent so many years avoiding the world, staying hidden away from the dangers she had seen others face. But now, for the first time, she felt like she had someone in her corner. Someone who would fight for her, someone who saw her as more than just an old woman trying to survive. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. It was no longer a future she had to face alone. "I have arranged everything, Mrs. Thompson, so you'll be safe for the time being," Victor said, his voice steady as he sat across from her at her kitchen table. The dim light from the early evening sun filtered in through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the small room. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as she set her teacup down on the table, her mind still struggling to grasp the events of the past few days. She had never imagined her life would take such a drastic turn, especially at this stage in her life. For years, she had kept to herself, hidden in the shadows, and now here she was, with a man like Victor D'Angelo, the Mafia boss, stepping into her world and offering her protection. But at what cost? "I don't know what to think about all this," she said, her voice quiet, filled with uncertainty. She met his gaze, her heart still racing from the whirlwind of emotions she had been feeling. "You've done so much for me already, but I still don't understand why." Victor's expression softened as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's simple," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "You deserve better. No one should be treated the way that driver treated you. You weren't just an old woman to him. You were a human being, deserving of respect. And I won't stand by and let anyone forget that." Mrs. Thompson blinked, taking in his words. For the first time, she felt seen, not as an elderly woman who had become invisible to the world, but as someone who mattered. It was a feeling she hadn't had in years, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. "But this is too much, Victor," she said softly, shaking her head. "I've lived quietly for so long. I don't want to get involved in your world. It's not for me." Victor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand. And I'm not asking you to be a part of my world. I'm just making sure you're safe. That's all." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected a more forceful approach, one that would demand her compliance. Instead, he was offering something far more unexpected: trust. The trust to let him help her, without expecting anything in return. Mrs. Thompson let out a long breath, looking down at her hands. "I've spent my whole life avoiding trouble," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've kept to myself, stayed out of sight. I don't know how to handle all of this." Victor's gaze softened further. He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, but he didn't touch it. "You don't have to handle it alone anymore," he said quietly. "That's why I'm here. I'm not asking for anything, Mrs. Thompson. I'm simply making sure that you don't have to face anything alone again." The warmth in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, Mrs. Thompson felt something other than fear or uncertainty. She felt comforted, and that scared her more than anything. "I don't know if I can accept your help," she said, her voice small. "I've lived my whole life without depending on anyone." Victor gave a small smile, his expression softening. "That's exactly why you deserve to have someone in your corner. You've spent so long being strong on your own. Now let me help you. You don't have to carry the weight of the world alone anymore." Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always prided herself on being independent, but the truth was, she was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of being alone. She didn't know what this would mean, accepting help from someone like Victor, but she knew one thing for sure. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite so helpless. "All right," she said quietly, her voice steady now. "I'll trust you, but don't make me regret it." Victor's smile widened, a rare and genuine smile that made his cold exterior seem a little less intimidating. "You won't regret it," he promised. He stood up and made his way to the door, pausing for a moment to glance back at her. "I'll be in touch soon," he said, his voice warm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Thompson, and don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." As the door clicked shut behind him, Mrs. Thompson stood still for a moment, her mind racing. She had just made a decision that could change everything. But for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone. The future was still uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be so bad with someone like Victor in her corner. She walked to the window, looking out at the city below. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope stir inside her. She didn't know what Victor's protection would mean in the long run, or what consequences it might bring. But one thing was clear. Things were about to change, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to see what came next. "I understand, Mrs. Thompson, that you need time to adjust," Victor said, his voice low, as he leaned back in the leather chair opposite her. The two had spent the last few weeks in a strange, unspoken understanding of one another. He had kept his promise. He made sure she was safe, checked in on her regularly, and ensured that no harm would come her way. But for Mrs. Thompson, the idea of letting someone into her life, especially someone like Victor, was still foreign. She had lived for so long in solitude, never asking for help, never leaning on anyone, and now she found herself faced with a dilemma. She didn't want to be a burden, yet the sense of protection that Victor provided was undeniable. She looked at him now, still unsure of how to proceed. "I don't know if I'm ready for this kind of life," she said quietly. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, unsure whether she was referring to the protection he was offering or the life she had been living before his intervention. "You don't have to be ready for anything, Mrs. Thompson. Just take things one day at a time," Victor replied, his voice warm yet commanding. "All I ask is that you trust me." His words hung in the air, like a promise, but a promise that carried weight, something more than just a casual reassurance. It was the kind of promise only someone like Victor D'Angelo could make and keep. She found herself nodding, though still uncertain. "I'm trying," she said, her voice barely audible. "But it's hard to trust, especially when I've spent my life avoiding trouble." "You've avoided trouble," Victor said, his tone thoughtful. "But trouble has a way of finding people, whether they seek it or not. The difference is, I can make sure you don't have to face it alone anymore." His words, as simple as they seemed, struck a chord with her. She had never considered her life as one that needed protection, but now, with Victor's words echoing in her mind, she began to wonder. Was she just surviving all this time, or had she been avoiding living? She looked at him, meeting his gaze for the first time with a sense of understanding. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'm tired of being invisible," she admitted. "Maybe I can learn to trust you." Victor's eyes softened, though his expression remained firm. "You don't need to rush, Mrs. Thompson. I'll be here when you're ready. But understand this, you don't have to hide anymore." The words struck deeper than she anticipated. For years, she had kept herself small, out of sight, out of mind. Now, Victor's words made her question whether she had been hiding from life itself. Was it so bad to let someone else in? To accept help, not out of weakness, but out of the realization that she deserved to live a life where she didn't have to face everything alone? Just as she was about to respond, her phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw the name of her longtime friend, Ruth, flash across it. "I should take this," Mrs. Thompson said, slightly flustered. "Excuse me for a moment." Victor gave her a slight nod, his gaze still on her, as if waiting for her to come to her own conclusions. Mrs. Thompson answered. The call, and the familiar voice of Ruth immediately filled the space. "Maggie, how are you? You've been quiet lately." "I'm fine, Ruth," Mrs. Thompson replied, trying to mask the uncertainty in her voice. "Just a lot on my mind." "I understand," Ruth said. "But you've been distant. You know I'm here for you, right?" Mrs. Thompson's chest tightened. She could feel Ruth's concern, but what could she say? How could she explain that she had been living a quiet life, and now someone like Victor D'Angelo had stepped into it? She couldn't tell Ruth the whole truth, not yet. "I've just been adjusting," she said, her voice soft. "You know how I am." Ruth paused on the other end of the line, as if sensing there was more. "Maggie, you've always been strong. But you don't have to do everything alone. If you ever need to talk, you know where I am." Mrs. Thompson's throat tightened. Ruth had always been there for her, a constant in her life. But now, things were different. She couldn't explain why, but she felt like she was standing at a crossroads in her life. Would she continue hiding from the world, or would she step into something new? "I'll call you soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure things out. Just remember, I'm here," Ruth said gently before hanging up. Mrs. Thompson set the phone down and looked back at Victor, who had been silent during the call. "It's hard to change," she said quietly. "I know," Victor replied. "But sometimes change is the only way to move forward. And moving forward, Mrs. Thompson, is exactly what you deserve." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so much of her life avoiding change, fearing what might happen if she let go of her old ways. But now, with Victor's steady presence in her life, she was beginning to understand that she didn't have to be afraid of what came next. She didn't have to be invisible anymore. "I'll try," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'll try to trust you." Victor nodded. "That's all I ask." As she watched him walk to the door, Mrs. Thompson realized that she was standing on the edge of something new, something that could change her life forever. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever that was. "I'm glad to hear you're doing better, Mrs. Thompson," Victor said, his voice calm, yet laced with concern as he stepped into her apartment. Mrs. Thompson was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her, though she hadn't touched it. The silence in the room was heavy, but there was something different in the air this time. A strange kind of peace had settled around her, something she hadn't experienced in years. It was as if her world was shifting, moving towards something unknown, yet undeniably comforting. "I didn't expect you to visit today," she replied, her voice a little softer than usual. "I thought we agreed that we would take things slow." Victor smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened his usually steely demeanor. "I know," he said, taking a seat across from her. "But I also know you're still processing everything, and I wanted to check in. I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Thompson. I'm not going to rush you, but I won't leave you to figure this out alone, either." She looked at him, still unsure of what to think, but something in his voice reassured her. She didn't know if she was ready for the life Victor was offering her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt as though there was someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. "It's hard," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my life avoiding attention. I've kept to myself, never asking for anything, never expecting anyone to step into my life. But now you're here, and I don't know what that means." Victor's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused on hers. "I understand," he said quietly. "But sometimes, we don't get to decide when things change. Sometimes life makes those decisions for us. What matters is what we do with those changes. And you don't have to face this alone." Mrs. Thompson felt her heart flutter in her chest. It was a sentiment she hadn't allowed herself to fully feel in years, someone standing beside her, offering not just protection, but a chance at something new, something more. But there was a hesitation in her, a fear of letting go of the life she had known. "I don't know if I can let you in," she said, her voice fragile. "I've lived so long without anyone, without depending on anyone. How do I just let someone in now?" Victor's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. "You don't have to let me in all at once," he replied gently. "You take it one step at a time. But you also have to let yourself be seen, Mrs. Thompson. People like you don't have to hide anymore." His words settled deep in her chest, like a promise, a reminder that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world by herself anymore. She sat quietly for a moment, letting his words wash over her. Her life had been one of isolation, of blending into the background, of being forgotten. But now, with Victor in her life, she couldn't help but wonder if things could be different. Could she truly let go of the past and embrace something new, something better? "You're right," she said finally, her voice steadying. "I've spent so long being invisible, but maybe it's time to change that. Maybe it's time to let go of the fear and take a chance." Victor gave her a slight nod, his eyes gleaming with something close to pride. "That's all I'm asking for, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "You don't have to change everything overnight. Just take the first step, and I'll be here to help you through the rest." She nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, she felt like she was ready to face it. "I'll try," she said quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'll try to trust you." "That's all I need," Victor said softly, standing up from the table. He walked to the door, pausing for a moment to look back at her. "Remember, you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, you have me in your corner." As he left, Mrs. Thompson sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She couldn't deny the shift that had taken place in her life. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a figure in the background. She was someone worth protecting, someone who mattered. And for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life, one where she wasn't alone. She didn't know where this journey with Victor would take her, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. "I'm glad to see you're doing well, Mrs. Thompson," Victor said as he walked into her apartment once more. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and things had felt quieter, almost too quiet, but in a way that allowed Mrs. Thompson to breathe. She had been processing everything Victor had said, everything that had changed in her life, and though uncertainty still lingered in her heart, she was starting to feel something she hadn't in years: hope. She stood by the window, looking out at the busy street below, the sounds of New York City buzzing just outside her door. But inside, it felt like a different world. A world where she wasn't invisible anymore. "Thank you for checking in," she said, her voice steady. But there was still a trace of uncertainty. "I've been thinking about what you said. About trusting you." Victor studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, yet somehow understanding. "I know this is hard for you," he replied softly, his voice laced with sincerity. "But trust is something that builds over time, and I'm not rushing you. You take it at your own pace. But just know, Mrs. Thompson, that I'm here for you." She looked at him, and for the first time, she felt like she wasn't talking to a Mafia boss, but to a man who genuinely cared. The weight of his words wasn't just the authority of someone used to getting what he wanted, but the quiet insistence of someone who believed in offering people a chance. "I'm trying, Victor," she said quietly, her hands folding the edge of her shawl nervously. "It's just, I've spent so many years living like this, alone. I didn't even know if I could trust someone again. And now you're offering me something I'm not sure I deserve." Victor shook his head slightly, his eyes softening. "You don't have to deserve it, Mrs. Thompson," he said gently. "You just have to accept it. You're not alone anymore." The simplicity of his words hit her harder than she expected. For so long, she had built walls around herself, kept everyone out to avoid being hurt. And now, Victor was here, offering her a place in a world she never imagined she could be a part of. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but the part of her that wanted to believe in something more than loneliness was starting to stir. "I don't know where this will lead," she confessed, her voice shaky. "But maybe I'm ready to let someone in." Victor didn't answer right away, but his gaze held hers for a long moment. It was as though he understood the weight of what she had just said, the significance of her words. He didn't rush her. He simply nodded, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "That's all I need, Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly. "Just knowing you're ready to trust. That's all I ask." She returned his smile, a tiny glimmer of hope in her chest. Maybe this was the beginning of something new for her, something that didn't have to be filled with fear and isolation. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it. Victor took a step toward the door, pausing just before leaving. "Remember," he said softly, "you don't have to do this alone anymore." His words hung in the air as he left, and Mrs. Thompson stood there, the room feeling lighter somehow. It wasn't just Victor's presence that had changed things. It was the idea of change itself. For so long, she had resisted it, afraid of what it might bring. But now, it felt like an invitation to something better, something she had longed for but never thought she could have. She walked over to the window, watching the world outside, but this time, she didn't feel so disconnected from it. There was a part of her that was ready to engage with the world again, to step out of the shadows and take a chance. A chance at something real, something beyond just survival. It wasn't going to be easy, she knew that. Trust didn't come easily for her, and the world Victor lived in was far from her own. But the thought of not being invisible anymore, of not having to face everything alone, made her heart feel a little lighter. For the first time, she wasn't running from what could be. She was standing still, ready to see where this unexpected chapter in her life would take her. She turned away from the window and smiled to herself. Maybe it wasn't about finding answers just yet. Maybe it was just about being willing to move forward, one small step at a time. "I see you've made progress, Mrs. Thompson," Victor said as he walked into her apartment, his eyes scanning the room with quiet approval. It had been weeks since their last conversation, and in that time, Mrs. Thompson had begun to adjust to the unexpected change in her life. The sense of isolation she had once clung to had started to fade, replaced by something that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. She stood in the kitchen, preparing tea, her movements now a little more relaxed, a little more confident. For the first time in a long while, she was taking care of herself, not just surviving, but actually living. "I didn't expect you to check in today," she replied, setting the teapot on the counter. "But it's good to see you." She couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief when he appeared at her door. As much as she had tried to keep her distance from the world, there was a part of her that was beginning to look forward to the company. Victor had been true to his word. He hadn't pushed her, hadn't rushed her, and most importantly, he had respected her boundaries. And yet, in all the time he had spent helping her, there had been a growing sense of security. "You've made great strides," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I can see it. You're not the same woman I met weeks ago." Mrs. Thompson turned to face him, her hands still on the teapot. "I'm trying," she said quietly. "I'm still not used to having someone around, but I'm starting to feel like maybe I can handle this." Victor gave her a small, approving smile, one that made her feel both seen and understood. "That's all I can ask, Mrs. Thompson. And remember, you don't have to do this on your own. Not anymore." The words hung in the air between them, but this time they felt different. They didn't carry the weight of obligation. Instead, they felt like an invitation, a simple truth she was beginning to accept. She let out a long breath, feeling the tension she hadn't realized was their start to ease. "I've spent so many years afraid of letting anyone in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I kept to myself, if I stayed out of sight, nothing bad could happen. But now I'm not so sure." She met his gaze, her eyes soft but filled with a quiet strength. Maybe I've been hiding from the wrong things." Victor didn't say anything at first, but his expression softened, as though he could understand exactly what she meant. There was a pause, a long moment of silence between them, before he spoke again. "We all hide from something, Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly. "But facing those fears, facing what we've been avoiding, that's where the real strength lies." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving, but actually moving forward. There had been a time when she had been afraid of change, afraid of letting someone else into her life. But now, with Victor's steady presence, she was starting to see that maybe she didn't have to face everything alone. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "For everything. For giving me a chance to see things differently." Victor smiled again, a smile that was both reassuring and encouraging. "It's not just me, Mrs. Thompson. It's you too. You've taken the first step, and that's the hardest part." She felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a sense of pride that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she had once believed. Maybe there was more to life than just getting by. "So what happens now?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Victor paused for a moment, as if considering his response. "Now, we take things one step at a time," he said finally. "I'm not asking for anything in return, Mrs. Thompson. I'm just here to make sure you're safe and that you have the chance to live your life on your own terms." She looked at him, feeling a sense of reassurance in his words. "You don't have to rush," he added. "We'll go at your pace. You deserve that." It was hard for Mrs. Thompson to admit, but in that moment, she realized that she was no longer afraid of what the future might hold. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't fighting to stay invisible. She was allowing herself to be seen, to be cared for, to take those first tentative steps towards something she had never allowed herself to want. Peace, connection, and maybe even a little bit of happiness. She nodded again, a small but determined gesture. "I'm ready," she said softly. "I'm ready to take that step." Victor's smile widened, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "Good," he said, his voice warm. "I'll be right here, every step of the way." As he left, Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway, watching him walk down the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, and she turned back into the apartment. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt heavy. Instead, it felt like the calm before a new beginning. Maybe the future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to face it. She wasn't invisible anymore. And that, she realized, was a freedom she hadn't known she needed. "I hope you've been doing all right, Mrs. Thompson," Victor said as he stepped into her apartment, his usual calm demeanor settling over the room. Mrs. Thompson was at the kitchen table again, but this time, she wasn't simply staring out the window or lost in thought. There was a quiet determination in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. The transformation in her was becoming more evident, and it both surprised and reassured her. She had taken Victor's advice to heart, one step at a time. She wasn't trying to rush into anything or force herself into a new life. Instead, she was learning to adjust, to trust the process. "I'm getting there, Victor," she replied, her voice steady but carrying a hint of gratitude. "I'm not quite where I want to be, but I'm better than I was. And that's something." Victor nodded, his eyes softening as he took in her words. He had watched her grow more comfortable in her own skin over the past few weeks, and though she still hesitated at times, he could see that the fear that had once clouded her every decision was starting to lift. It wasn't that she was suddenly fearless. It was that she was learning to live with the fear and move forward anyway. I'm glad to hear that, Victor said with a slight smile. I told you that you didn't have to do this alone. Mrs. Thompson let out a soft laugh, though it was tinged with a little sadness. You know, it's strange. For so long, I thought that being alone was the safest way to live. But now, I'm starting to wonder if maybe I was wrong. Victor's expression softened as he took a step closer to the table. It's not easy to open up to others, especially when you've spent years keeping yourself hidden, he said quietly. But sometimes, the hardest thing to do is the thing that gives us the most peace. Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. I've spent so much time afraid of being hurt or disappointed, she said. I didn't want to risk it. But now, I see that maybe I was holding myself back. I was never really living, was I? It's never too late to start living, Victor replied softly, his voice steady with conviction. You're doing it right now, just by facing those fears, just by letting yourself be seen. For a moment, there was silence between them, a quiet understanding that settled in the space. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath and finally met Victor's gaze. I'm not used to feeling important, she said, her voice quiet. But with you, I don't feel invisible anymore. And that scares me. Victor smiled, though it was a small, knowing smile. You don't have to be afraid of that, he said gently. Being seen doesn't mean you're vulnerable. It means you're allowing yourself to be valued, to be cared for. And that's something worth embracing. Mrs. Thompson felt a warmth in her chest at his words, a warmth that she hadn't felt in so long. She had always prided herself on being independent, on taking care of herself. But now, as she allowed herself to be seen, to trust in someone like Victor, she was starting to understand that it wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was allowing herself to be part of something bigger than just surviving. I'm trying, Victor, she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. I'm trying to learn what it means to live, not just get by. Victor nodded, his eyes filled with approval. And you're doing great, Mrs. Thompson. You don't have to rush the process. Just take it one day at a time, and remember, you're not alone in this. The words were simple, but they held a power that resonated with her in a way nothing else had. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead her, but for the first time, she was no longer afraid to take the next step. As the days passed, Mrs. Thompson found herself growing more comfortable with the changes in her life. She spent more time with Victor, not as someone who was being saved, but as someone who was beginning to understand her own worth. She no longer felt like a passive bystander in her own life, but a participant. And though the path ahead wasn't always clear, she knew that with each step, she was moving towards something better. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden light over the city, Mrs. Thompson stood by the window once more, but this time, she wasn't looking out at the world with uncertainty. She was looking at it with a quiet confidence, a feeling she hadn't had in years. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found someone who saw her for who she was, not just as an old woman, not just as someone who had lived in the shadows, but as someone with a future, someone with value. And that, she realized, was all she had ever needed. As the days went by, she knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more things to face, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready. Ready to embrace the future, ready to let herself be seen, and ready to live her life, not just survive it. I know it's been a while, Mrs. Thompson, Victor said, his voice calm as he stepped into the apartment, a subtle but reassuring presence. Mrs. Thompson had grown more accustomed to his visits in recent weeks. She had even started looking forward to them. Something about Victor's presence made the apartment feel less empty, less lonely. She had spent the past several months learning to trust, to open up, to embrace the changes that had slowly crept into her life. She was no longer just surviving. She was starting to live. I'm doing better, Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady, but a small smile played at the corner of her lips. She wasn't just saying the words. She meant them. There was a sense of peace in her now that hadn't been there before. It's not perfect, but I think I'm finally understanding what you meant. Victor's gaze softened as he sat down at the table across from her, his eyes taking in the subtle but noticeable changes. The apartment was no longer the space of quiet solitude it once had been. It had transformed into something warmer, more welcoming. The shelves that had once sat untouched were now filled with small mementos, Photos that weren't just reminders of the past, but symbols of a future. I'm glad to hear that, Victor said, his voice rich with approval. It's not about perfection, Mrs. Thompson. It's about progress, about learning to see yourself differently, about embracing the life that's right in front of you. She nodded, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her coffee mug. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about not being invisible anymore. It's still hard sometimes, she admitted, her voice quieter now. But I think I'm starting to understand that I don't have to be afraid of being seen, that I'm allowed to take up space. Victor's expression was soft, but filled with a quiet intensity. You've always had the right to take up space, Mrs. Thompson. You've just been hiding from it. But you don't have to anymore. And I'm here to make sure you know that. The words seemed to settle over her like a blanket, warm and reassuring, but it was more than that. It was the way he spoke them, like they were the truth, undeniable and unspoken. For the first time, Mrs. Thompson allowed herself to believe them. She had spent so many years hiding, playing small, trying not to be noticed. But now, with Victor's steady presence in her life, she was learning that maybe it wasn't so bad to be seen after all. I've spent so much time alone, she continued, her voice a little softer now, as if she were admitting something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. I never thought I needed anyone. But now I feel like I've been missing something. Victor leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused on her. You've been missing the most important thing, Mrs. Thompson, he said quietly. Connection. The ability to share your life with others. You don't have to live in isolation anymore. Not if you don't want to. She felt her heart tighten at his words, a strange mix of fear and longing stirring within her. What if I'm not ready for that? She asked, the vulnerability in her voice surprising her. What if I can't change, or if it all falls apart? Victor smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the edges of his usually stoic expression. You're already changing, Mrs. Thompson, he said gently. And change doesn't happen overnight. But you've taken the first step. And that's all I'm asking for. You're not alone in this. You don't have to do it by yourself. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over her, a sense of relief that had been missing for so long. Maybe she didn't have all the answers. Maybe she didn't know where this journey was going, or what the future would hold. But for the first time, she felt like she was finally moving forward, not just surviving, but actually living. I'm starting to believe that, she said softly, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I'm starting to believe that maybe I can have a life I don't have to hide from. Victor nodded, a small but satisfied smile on his face. That's all anyone can ask for, he said. And you're doing it, one step at a time. As he stood to leave, Mrs. Thompson felt a strange sense of loss, like she didn't want him to go. It wasn't that she was dependent on him. It was that, for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face the world. And she wasn't doing it alone. Thank you, Victor, she said, her voice full of gratitude. For everything. Victor paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and turned back to her. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. You're doing the hard work. I'm just here to help when you need it. And with that, he left, leaving Mrs. Thompson standing in the doorway, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. She wasn't invisible anymore. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to be seen. As the days passed, Mrs. Thompson felt herself change in ways she hadn't expected. Each morning, she woke with a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of her past no longer holding her down as it once did. She no longer avoided the world. Instead, she began to step into it with quiet confidence. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when doubt crept in, when the fear of opening up again threatened to paralyze her. But those moments were fewer and farther between. Every step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory. And it was all because of Victor. His presence in her life, though unexpected, had become a source of stability she hadn't realized she needed. As much as she tried to convince herself that she could do it on her own, Victor had shown her that there was no weakness in asking for help, no shame in letting someone in. One evening, as the sun set over the city, casting long shadows through her apartment, Mrs. Thompson found herself thinking about how far she had come. She was sitting by the window again, a habit she had developed over the years, watching the world go by. But this time, she wasn't just observing. It felt like she was a part of it. The life she had once avoided was now within reach. She had allowed herself to be seen, and in doing so, had reclaimed a part of herself she thought she had lost. There was a knock at the door, and her heart gave a small flutter. She knew who it was. Victor. She stood and walked to the door, opening it to find him standing there, as calm and composed as ever. But today, there was something different in his eyes. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing," he said with a slight smile. Mrs. Thompson returned the smile, her heart warming at the sight of him. "I'm doing well, Victor," she said, her voice steady. "Better than I ever have, I think." Victor's smile widened, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, stepping inside. "I knew you had it in you, Mrs. Thompson." She felt a lump rise in her throat at his words. She had spent so long hiding, so long thinking she wasn't capable of anything more than just getting by. But now, here she was, standing in front of a man who saw her, who believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. "Thank you," she said softly, the words more meaningful than she could explain. "I didn't know I could do this, but I think I'm finally starting to believe that I can." Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression gentle. "You've always been capable, Mrs. Thompson. You just needed to see it for yourself." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that went deeper than just praise. For the first time, Mrs. Thompson realized that she had been holding herself back all these years. It wasn't the world that had kept her hidden, it was herself. And now, she was finally allowing herself to be seen. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice soft, yet filled with a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed. "Now," Victor said, his voice steady and certain, "you keep going. You keep living. And I'll be here, as promised, to make sure you never have to face anything alone." Mrs. Thompson felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to hide anymore. The world was wide open before her, and for the first time in years, she was ready to face whatever it had to offer. She wasn't afraid of the future anymore, because she knew she had the strength to meet it head-on. "Thank you, Victor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Thompson. You did the hard part. You took the first step, and that's all I ever asked of you." She nodded, the weight of his words settling in. She had done it. She had taken the first step, and though she didn't know what the future would bring, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid to walk forward. As Victor turned to leave, Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway, watching him go, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had found her place in the world again. And for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. In this heartwarming tale of transformation, Mrs. Thompson embarks on a journey that challenges her beliefs about trust and relationships. After a life spent in solitude and fear of being vulnerable, she finds herself drawn into an unexpected connection with Victor, a man with a powerful presence who offers her not just protection, but a chance at a new life. As their bond deepens, Mrs. Thompson begins to realize that she is worthy of more than just surviving. She is capable of thriving and embracing the love and support she never thought possible. This story, filled with emotion, struggle, and eventual redemption, is a beautiful addition to the collection of romance stories that show the power of love and kindness in transforming lives. As she learns to trust Victor and step into the world she once avoided, Mrs. Thompson discovers that taking risks can lead to profound change, and sometimes, the greatest romance stories are those that unfold quietly, between two people who learn to see each other for who they truly are. Victor's unwavering support and Mrs. Thompson's courage to face her fears bring them closer, leading to a future where both can finally step out of the shadows and into the light. If you love heartfelt romance stories that focus on personal growth, connection, and the healing power of love, this is a must-read. Let yourself be swept away by this moving narrative that reminds us all that it's never too late to embrace love, change, and the chance to live fully. Discover how love, in all its forms, is the key to unlocking a future full of hope, happiness, and endless possibilities. This captivating story is just one of many romance stories that remind us of the beauty found in unexpected connections and the strength that comes from learning to trust again.